So we're in a time period where everybody is like, the US is really bad, it's gone far right, it's going down the tube. Sure, all of these things are very correct. But then you look on the list of countries that people tell you to go to instead, and it's a bunch of countries that are also getting worse. And while we can debate the semantics or the details of, well, these countries are getting worse, but they're still better than the US, or, well, I would still take living in Canada or New Zealand in a heartbeat, the reality is that all of these countries are going to feel the same effects of the same ongoing global situation. And that while the United States is at the center of it in many ways as the dominant power, as the hegemony, the reality is that in most parts of the world, right-wing movements are gaining steam or gaining more political power, or both. That's particularly to be said about the quote-unquote global north, and particularly to be said about these Western countries that have for a long time been hailed as the epitome of democracy and progressive values. So what happened? First of all, I want to talk about why I'm talking about this, because this is an evergreen topic. But in particular, I was really compelled by a subreddit. I was compelled by a post from this Behind the Bastards subreddit, one of the many subreddits that I joined for various reasons, saying not enough people are aware of just how fucked New Zealand is at the moment. Danae, when you edit this, you can censor the F word. So this is a response to the not extremely recent hard right movement of the New Zealand government. So in October of 2023, Christopher Luxon became prime minister. He built basically a coalition of different right-wing sentiments with the goal of doing the same shit right-wingers do everywhere. We got a cost of living crisis. We got all these immigrants. We got all this woke. We need to get rid of it. We need to destroy the social safety nets. We need to do all these things in the name of putting our country first. And the subreddit shared this video in particular from the Juice Media, which does this kind of critical, satirical commentary about New Zealand politics and Australian politics.
Visit New Zealand, majestical land of beauty, exotic birds, delicacies like hot pies and ghost chips, and home to a people with a deep love of nature and the world's sexiest accent. Suck shit, Aussies. It's also home to the epic trilogy, The Landlord of the Rings, in which a bunch of rich wankers form a government to steal from Kiwis and give themselves tax breaks on their investment properties. Starring Christopher Gollum, Saruman Peters, and his dipshit sidekick, and The Eye of Seymour, directed by the Atlas Network. Now please rise for our national anthem. Kia ora, I'm from the government of New Zealand, the pure green haven you've been thinking of escaping to when your country is hit by fires, floods and fascism. Except now, Kiwis are...
Let me actually play that part back in particular.
The pure green haven you've been thinking of escaping to when your country is hit by fires, floods and fascism. Except now...
One more time for the people in the back.
The pure green haven you've been thinking of escaping to when your country is hit by fires, floods and fascism. Except now, Kiwis are escaping New Zealand. And that's because since we've taken over, we've left no corner of this country unfucked. We kicked thousands out of emergency housing, cut equity pay for nurses and teachers, cut funding for food banks, cut disability funding, cut KiwiSaver, cut public transport discounts, and cut part-time workers' sick leave. National Party, putting the N back in cuts. And sure, our cuts to school lunches are making kids dumber, but that's how we're ensuring a new generation of national voters, which is...
So you can kind of get the point of where this is going. And in particular, it doesn't stop there, right? There's been anti-trans legislation that's been recently proposed in New Zealand.
You need to know what's happening in New Zealand and the UK right now, because it is undeniably getting harder. You see, New Zealand is now looking to follow in the UK's footsteps by introducing a new bill that specifically says what a man or woman is into law. And I think we all know where this is going to go. And of course, once this is signed into law, just like in the UK, trans women will now be exempt from entering any women-only spaces.
It's the same playbook. It's the same stuff, right? And where you can still see sometimes people on other subreddits, my beef with Reddit never ends, is talking about how absolutely not, New Zealand is not right-wing, it's way better than the United States, stop listening to the propaganda. Even if you were to take them as correct, the direction that they're going in is the same direction. And by the time that you get to New Zealand, it will have gotten worse. And by the time you've stayed there for a couple of years, it may likely have gotten worse again. Why is this the case? Why is it the case that from New Zealand to Australia to across Europe, anybody remember Europe? I know it's easy to forget because they're so irrelevant these days. But recently, Europe and the far right of Europe has followed Trump in calling for Antifa to be declared terrorists. This is from Jennifer Rankin in Brussels for The Guardian. We're talking about the Netherlands. We're talking about Hungary with the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban passing resolutions declaring that Antifa is a terrorist organization. We've already talked on this channel before, that being the Elliot Sang Again channel, of course, about how the European far right is rising, how social issues in Europe are continuing to become more and more toxic in the same vein as they are in America, how from Germany to France to the UK, you have right-wing parties continuing to push right-wing agendas in either a direct alliance with Trump or in similar fashion to Trump to kind of capitalize off of that political momentum or to capitalize off of that voter base, those ideas. And we've also talked about how that reflects on endemic issues of racism and discrimination in those countries. So again, your safe haven countries, from Canada to Australia to Europe to, wait, what about outside the Western world? Well, mixed bag, but we get a sense of what's going on when we look at everybody's favorite low-key far-right country, Japan. This is a great content creator named Shunya on TikTok, who a couple of months ago made this TikTok about Japanese politics.
Japan is on the verge of falling under fascist government. In the recent upper parliament election in Japan, the ruling LDP and Komeito lost its majority, and the far-right Sanseitou and right-wing populist DPFP won a lot of seats. And in response to this election result, many within the LDP are calling for Ishiba to resign. However, in order to stop Japan from falling under fascist government, we need Ishiba to stay in power. Ishiba is a conservative, but he is an honest conservative in a sense that he acknowledges that Japan committed atrocities against Koreans, Chinese, and other East to Southeastern Asian people during...
What essentially Shunya's getting at is a divide that is happening in Japanese politics, which is essentially an assemblage of different right-wing parties, in which one of them has become kind of ascendant as this far right party that is COVID vaccine denialist, COVID denialist, anti-trans, and the hardest anti-immigration. And then in recent days, we all know about Sanae Takaichi, right? Who was just brought to the top of the lead party of Japan, which is essentially a one-party state, the Liberal Democratic Party. She was elected by the party to become its head, and she is as far right as the party has ever gotten. She was once a heavy metal drummer. People talk about this a lot. She was also a scuba diver. And she has a very strong anti-immigration stance. She has a very strong interest in tax deductions for the rich. She also wants to expand hospital services for women's health and has a complex kind of network of different policies, but with the aim of essentially pushing a very kind of chauvinistic and very far-right Japanese polity. Let's see if we can pull up another video about Sanae Takaichi, who, by the way, is getting contested by the center-right Conservative Party, which has been in coalition with the LDP for a really long time.
Japan just got its own version of Trump. Her slogan, Japan Back. Sanae Takaichi, now the new leader of Japan's ruling party, is said to become Japan's first female prime minister. She is ultra-conservative, denies Japan's wartime crimes, and often visits the Yasukuni Shrine, a move that always angers China and South Korea. Her message is simple: Japan first. She wants to boost defense spending, limit foreign capital, and make Japan more independent from both China and the US.
This is a kind of autarkic economic policy, right?
But here's the twist. Trump's America first and her Japan first might actually crash. Washington may like her anti-China stance, but Trump hates allies who act too independent.
So there's that rundown. This is another development, ultimately, in a push for mainstream Japanese politics to go farther and farther right. Now, I want to make a couple of caveats here because there's certain points that are always made when I start talking about this and start using the rhetoric that I do. For one, yes, the United States is a shithole. Yes, if you want to leave the United States, I totally understand. My advice has always been to, for one, not look at other countries as safe havens that will protect you from the rise of this far-right movement. And for two, to make sure that when you move to a different country, you have some type of institutional backing there, either in the form of a work visa or being a part of a skilled worker category, as Canada is currently looking for, or having a student visa, etc. Have some reason that the government can't just expel you for any particular reason. And be mindful of the fact that immigration is a very segregated process that benefits those with money, those who are able-bodied, those who belong to certain ethnic categories that are, let's say, privileged in those countries. But that's not to say that if you are feeling fear about living in the United States and you want to move to Canada because you're a trans person or because you're black, you're Mexican, that's a stupid idea or like an idea that should be outright dismissed. I understand that there are many reasons that people want to move, and I'm not trying to discourage or encourage people from leaving the United States. I'm just trying to give people a bit of a pragmatic understanding of that. Anyway, that's what I've been talking about before. Another thing that I want to mention as a caveat is that no, every single country is not going far right. There are different countries that are being pointed at, in fact, as having governments that are moving in a more progressive direction and that have wide popular appeal from the masses of those countries. The one that especially sticks out is Mexico, which is a country that has developed all these new social programs, that has promised to sort of end neoliberalism, has also sort of taken a knife against corruption in the government, to varying degrees of success and to varying degrees of acclaim. And many people will differ in opinions of how much they support those regimes, but it is proof in and of itself that no, every country is not pushing farther right. As a matter of fact, this is a phenomenon we're seeing mostly in the global north, meaning with Japan being the biggest ally of the United States, as well as many different European countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. These OECD global north countries are having this far right push. In the global south, we see mixed results. We even see situations like in Africa, where in Burkina Faso, as well as in a coalition with other countries of the Sahel, there is a push to kind of wean off of European imperialism and build more social safety nets. There's also some legally entrenched homophobia that's apparently being pushed there. So it's a bit more complicated than just saying left versus right, as it always is. Remember that these are terms that we use to describe a pretty debatable spectrum. Now, all of this preamble is just to talk about the central question, which is the title of my video, right? Why is this happening? Because whatever amount you disagree with the assertion or agree with the assertion that everywhere is getting worse or that the far right is rising, etc., there is something true to it. It is true that these far-right populist parties are gaining steam, far-right populist organizations are gaining steam, austerity and all these different things are leading the way in a lot of these different OECD countries. It is true that even in the United States, the supposed left-wing party, the Democratic Party, has been pushing farther and farther right for a long time now, and that this is essentially part of the problem. But why is this happening? There are a lot of different answers to this question, but I want to start with the ones I disagree with, or at the very least think that we have to put to rest. And I'm going to go over them in order from, in my mind, least to most interesting answers. Does that sound okay? Everybody okay with that? Is Cuba getting more progressive? It's hard to speak about what's happening in Cuba because obviously everybody's talked about the blockade. Cuba has put forth a lot more sort of socially progressive legislation about sex and gender a couple of years ago. But Cuba is also kind of struggling to figure out how it's going to deal with these global economic crises. The world has gone far right because the status quo has not worked and contradictions have come ahead. That's not a terrible answer, honestly. Some of what you've just said is what I'm going to be saying. I hate that we have women and sometimes lesbians leading the fascist movements. Well, fascism, like any other right-wing movement, like any other political movement, adapts over time to figure out how to cultivate the largest base. So a lot of things have changed in terms of social progressivism. It's also very convenient to have a woman leading a far conservative movement, you know. Are you guys ready for me to talk about the wrong answers to this question? Yeah, okay. Thank you guys for being such a cool crowd, by the way. The first wrong answer to why is everywhere getting more right-wing is morals have declined. Essentially that everybody's morals have dropped off steadily or all at once since XYZ event. A lot of people will say this about COVID. COVID took us all away from each other. Because of COVID, we all sheltered ourselves in our houses and we radicalized online and we stopped learning how to treat each other as our neighbors and love each other. This explanation makes no sense. Morals are not something that just suddenly declined. People were never that moral. You can't just say that, oh, the United States in 2018, 2019, our morals were in a pretty good place. It doesn't make any sense. As a matter of fact, some people saw COVID as like this radicalizing event that turned a lot of people more moral because they had more time for themselves and because they were able to engage with politics. I remember Black Lives Matter. You remember that happened in 2020? The literal movement of civil rights that was inspired in part by people being at home and witnessing things online. So moral decline and cognitive decline, even more so, make no sense. It's not something you can calculate. Humans are not moral creatures. Politics is not a moral sphere. Politics is decided by interests. It is this complex debate between different interests being secured within different groups and different elites. Anybody that turns to this idea that we were more moral in the past is making an intrinsically conservative argument. Even if they vote Democrat, even if they like gay people, they're making a reactionary conservative argument. Because it's appealing to an idea of something that didn't exist. It's appealing to an idea of modernity being the bane of existence, of modern stuff being the problem. It's very Timothy McVeigh coded. Was it Timothy McVeigh? No, I'm not Timothy McVeigh. You guys know who I'm talking about. The other terrorist who wrote this whole doctrine about how modernity is ruining the world. And some people were like, this guy was actually based. Regardless, morality is not ever going to get you solid answers for how to understand politics. The second wrong answer. The left did too much purity testing and destroyed the liberal parties. This is the answer that apparently popular center-left, centrist, center-right, liberal voices are kind of appealing to. We saw some of this invoked in Ted Kaczynski, sorry, thank you. We saw some of this evoked with Ezra Klein in his interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates. Did you guys see that? That was a mess. Where Ezra Klein continues, even as Ta-Nehisi Coates, this liberal but very staunch advocate for black civil rights and critic of the American empire. Even as this guy's sitting in front of him, he's still trying to be like, but don't you think we have to appeal to the right-wingers more? Don't you think we have to appeal to the hateful people more? And it's always stuff like, well, trans rights, people push too hard on the trans. And that alienated people. And so instead we should stop talking about the trans so much and maybe let them do some of their hate stuff and then they'll vote Democrat. This doesn't make any sense. It's a terrible strategy. First and foremost, if you want to appeal to right-wingers and hateful values, then you need to be the most hateful. Otherwise, they're going to vote for people who are more hateful than you. You can't give people diet Republican and expect them to vote anything but Republican. That doesn't make any sense. It's a terrible strategy. Number two, we're seeing in certain parts of this Western world where right-wingers are rising to power, we're seeing ostensibly left of center political organizations and politicians win elections. In Canada, there was this far right-wing turn that was apparently on the horizon, and then when Trump got elected and alienated people in Canada, that basically led the way for Mark Carney and the Liberal Party to come to power. Similar things happening in France. The far-right National Rally was gaining momentum in France, was looking to win the prime ministerial election, and the centrist, center-right, ostensibly center-left had to turn to building a broad-based coalition of left-of-center parties that eventually won a referendum, and of course now that's turned into a whole mess. But you see, it's not necessarily even an election problem in a lot of places. You can't say that the right wing is dying in Canada or dying in France simply because of those elections. Blaming the minorities is a terrible idea. It's also a horrible thing to do. You should be building a large coalition of people because you're supposed to stand for equality. You're supposed to stand for human rights, right? Especially if that's like your whole jig as a political party. Never mind just the immorality of that and how revelatory it is that certain people are really not our friends at all. And number two, the problem hasn't even been necessarily the elections themselves, more so that they have been issues of policy and culture. Of course, the elections matter. We just talked about New Zealand. We've talked about Japan a little bit, where the left wing doesn't have any sort of voice in establishment politics. But a lot of the difficulties that are happening in establishment politics are also internal. It's not a matter of right-wing voters just got alienated by the political establishment and then turned farther right. It's a matter of, in Japan, the party within itself elected its farthest right representative to try to wean off the surge in far-right sentiment from the Japan First Party. I'm forgetting the name of the farther right party that's risen in prominence in Japan. In the United States, Kamala Harris just put out a book where she basically said Joe Biden destroyed my campaign. He made sure that I never distanced myself from him. He made sure that I never, expressed public disagreement with him. His whole campaign was a botched failure, a disaster that he held on for too long because a lot of people wanted to save their own jobs. And then they undermined me and the whole democratic process by putting me, Kamala Harris, vice president, as the Democratic candidate without a primary, and also continuously undermining from within so that I wouldn't get certain funding from certain people if I didn't cop the Biden line and praise Joe Biden. And we know that politics in general is a matter of people pushing against status quo whenever things are bad in their minds, right? So people did not want to vote for the same as usual when they hated the same as usual. Another thing that's really strange about this is that it's not as if the left of center governments or the ostensibly left of center governments are doing all this lefty stuff. So we just talked about Mark Carney, right? Mark Carney, we just talked about in the previous stream about Canada, is pushing austerity measures in Canada. You know, same old right-wing neoliberal goodness, and also pushing near-record military expenditures due to what the United States is pushing on them. And then what happened under Joe Biden? Was it like Joe Biden was like super pro-Palestine and woke and super pro-trans? No. If you remember, Joe Biden was staunchly against pro-Palestine sentiment. He backed a ton of police repression against nonviolent anti-genocide protests, as worded here by the World Socialist website, Patrick Martin. Order must prevail, Biden said. So even where there have been the non-far-right parties in power, they're doing far-right shit. You can't argue with this, right? I'm so sick of Democrats writing books. Me too, Jonathan. Me too, Jonathan. But what I'm speaking to is that the Democratic Party in and of itself had way more issues internally that destroyed its chances of winning the election beyond just, oh, we were too woke. Like where does that even factor in? Bizarre, right? And yes, he was Stephen Harper's finance minister. He was the head of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. So this answer doesn't make any sense. Where there is something a little bit interesting about it is that it speaks to how the left has been alienated. And if we're going to speak about fascism and the far right, we have to speak about the position of people with left-wing values, left-wing ideals in society, and specifically how they're being repressed and attacked. And so if there's anything to say about what the left's role has been in all of this, it's been that more and more people have radicalized away from the fake left-wing parties in their governments because they've gone farther and farther right and been more and more destructive to them, to the environment, to other countries. And they're getting turned off by that. And they're going online and they're learning about all the other types of political thinking that they can get into and political work that they can do. And they're trying to push those things to change. So economic populism is very popular and pro-Palestine sentiment is very popular. Did that really affect the elections? No. I mean, Jill Stein and third-party voting was a non-factor completely. There was not a single state, Wisconsin or otherwise, in the United States election that would have went to Kamala Harris if not for Jill Stein voters, for instance. And of the many Democrat Party voters that stayed home, many of them, we don't have really the answers as to why they stayed home. A lot of them were in swing states. There's some evidence that, young white men pushed a little bit farther right. Why? Because they've been radicalized by this far-right machine that's operating in a lot of ways independent of elections. So if you're interested in how the left factors into all of this, then you need to be looking at it as a phenomenon that is happening in a response to this far-right movement that's already happening in a lot of ways, and in a response to a period of economic turmoil and social turmoil and political collapse. So that's not the right answer. What else is a wrong answer? Here's an interesting one. America went fascist and everyone else was forced to do so. You hear this sometimes, right? Especially from other countries. Other countries will talk about America as if America is with a gun pointed at them and saying, you have to vote for this. And this is kind of true. But I think it undermines the accountability that these countries have to take. And when I speak about these countries, I mean the political establishment of these countries. Yes, the world is dominated by U.S. hegemony. Yes, what happens in the United States has huge ripple effects everywhere else. Necessarily so. Economically, politically, socially. Yes, the United States has gone far right. And yes, a lot of the far right surging in the rest of the world has taken some notes from what Trump has done, what MAGA has done, as well as the direction generally of the U.S. economy in terms of building their own right-wing populist movements. So yes, there's a lot to be said for how when America sneezes, everybody catches a cold. But here's what I dislike about this, and here's what's inherently anti-intellectual about this point. So you're telling me that if the United States simply elected Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever as president, that all these other countries would simply mind their own business and do what's good for their citizens. So you're telling me that the government of New Zealand and the governments of Canada and the governments of Europe, Western Europe within the EU, they're these well-meaning governments that are just trying to do their best for their people. But gosh, by golly, the United States just keeps messing things up for everybody else, and then we just have to shift the other way. Is that really a useful point at all? Does that reflect reality at all? In certain cases, there have been right-wingers that have seized power before Trump seized power within Europe. I mean, Italy, right? Hungary, Viktor Orban, right? You have these governments and these political movements that have kind of been almost inspirational for Trump himself. Viktor Orban, you can look at as being an inspiration for Trump, or being a close ally of Trump, right? It's very amusing that these Western OECD powers, instead of looking at themselves and saying, where did we go wrong? How do we get this empire back on the right track? How do we represent more of the interests of vulnerable people in the period of time when the right wing is clearly gaining momentum by appealing to people suffering? Instead of saying that, these governments are saying, we just can't. What are we going to do? And all these, again, Reddit-brained people go online and go, my country would be so great if it wasn't for the U.S. and their damn power. And it gets all these upvotes, right? Because it appeals to something that's kind of true, that's kind of important to point out. But it's ultimately really reductive. These European countries never take accountability. These Western countries never take accountability for being fundamentally capitalist, neoliberal governments of smaller stature that work essentially as tributary states of the U.S. They follow the U.S.'s lead because the U.S. is the center of commerce, the center of capital, and all these other countries are led by people who have never had the interests of the people at heart, have always found a way to balance the different interests of their polities with making money, taking care of themselves, getting themselves power. And the idea that everything would have been fine if Trump just never got elected, it's like backwards thinking. Because why would Trump have gotten elected in the first place if everything was fine? So my last wrong answer that I have listed that I'll talk about before I give my answer is essentially kind of true, kind of wrong, but wrong in a really important way. So it's the sentiment that I saw on that Reddit post about New Zealand that so much progress was achieved that it scared the right wing. Essentially, over the 20th century, we were achieving so much progress, and the right wing had to do something to put evil back on top or whatever. So they conspired behind the scenes for decades to build this strong right-wing coalition to create the perfect plan to destroy international liberal democracy, to destroy the progressive values of these Western countries. There is a lot to be said about the way that the right wing has built power since the 50s, about the new coalition between libertarianism, Christian nationalism, and war hawks to build this far-right movement we see today. There's a lot to be said also about there having been significant quality of life growth and changes, especially in the Western countries, over the 20th century, tons of economic growth, and then tons of different social systems that took care of tons of people. The World War II New Deal era government and all these other different social democracies that emerged, again, in service of the United States, but still emerged with all these different social welfare protections of their citizens after World War II. There's a lot to be said for how those social democracies, for instance in Scandinavia, how those social welfare systems declined over time as the United States and its social welfare system declined over time. There's a lot to be said for how we lost things that we used to have. That being said, I think that sometimes we think about this, again, in very conservative terms that are ultimately anti-intellectual. Because what do you mean things used to be good and then they got bad? What do you mean we had triumphed over fascism in World War II and then over time they conspired in a cave and figured out how to take over the world again? What do you mean we made all of this progress? Progress for who? Who were the beneficiaries? Who were the people that were orchestrating this progress and what were their intentions? You know, you can get into a whole conversation about FDR, somebody who has been characterized as a traitor to his class and in many ways bore that as a label within his class for being this political elite who engineered all these social democratic reforms in the United States in World War II and became the FDR we know today, this mythical figure. But he did it while telling the capitalist classes, stand back, I got this. I'm going to save capitalism. And much of these same progressive reforms happened under that same banner. If we get rid of the communists, and if we take away all the power from the socialists by incorporating some concessions to their causes, we can build a structure where the capitalist classes can get richer than ever. And eventually, as those, we'll talk about it, inevitable capitalist crises emerge, you can find all these different ways to chip away at that social welfare system, and you'll be back on top, and everything will be good business as usual. What does that speak of the other things that happened in the rest of the world while all these OECD countries were in their golden age? What happened in Palestine after World War II? You know, what happened across the African continent? What happened across Latin America? What happened in the Middle East? What happened to Arab socialism? What happened to Salvador Allende? And frankly, was it all that big reform and big progress? Or was it periods of concessions and winnings from the capitalist classes being distributed to the polity so as to basically give people goodie bags and gifts so that they stayed in power? How much of this really was sustainable and really was earned by the people at all, really was for the people at all? Beeson, that's what he tried. In some ways he did, yeah. Many people tried to stand up against US hegemony. The history of the 20th century is this amazing era of Keynesian economics and social progress for white people in the OECD world. But all of the attempts by marginalized people, oppressed people, queer people, Black Americans, colonized peoples, to fight against colonialism were repressed so successfully and so powerfully that it utterly destroyed the left and left no room for any type of caution or self-critique within the right wing. So what structures were there even that existed that could have provided any help for any marginalized people beyond trickle-down economics? And we all know that that doesn't really work. So those are 4 wrong answers. Now I'm going to tell you what I think is the right answer. To do so, I want to look away a little bit from elections, from social media discourse, and I want to look a little bit more at systemic problems. And I promise when we end here, you're going to feel as energized and hopeful and aware as you ever have. That's a pretty lofty promise, but some of you will feel that way. But to get there, we need to talk about the fact that we live under systems that fundamentally don't work, that collapse every 2 business days, and that with their continuation accelerate the destruction of life on this planet. So I want to talk about, first of all, the internal contradictions of capital accumulation. Really quickly. Why? Because to me, the answer to why everywhere is going more right-wing, it seems, is one word. It's the word crisis. And this is a very polarizing word. Oh, it can go in many different directions, this word. But you cannot understand why politics change, why societies change, why culture changes, why young white boys start following Nick Fuentes on YouTube, and why Germany's AfD starts rising to more and more prominence. You can't understand anything if you don't understand crisis. When we talk about the internal contradictions of capital accumulation, I actually want to use this Wikipedia article, but I want to give an asterisk here. Because first of all, while Wikipedia can be a very useful encyclopedic source to find other information, in this case, the sourcing of this is terrible. Somebody wrote this 9-step list of the process of economic crises, attributes it to David Harvey, and then if you watch what it cites, it's a video of a great lecture by David Harvey that everybody should watch. But if you watch it, it's 11 minutes. He doesn't go over these steps. He talks about like basically step 1 and then makes mention of certain things in the rest of these steps. But somebody just made this up, basically. Somebody just took what his views are and made up this list. While this is very bad, don't do this. And this is a, revelatory of some of the problems of using Wikipedia. They also kind of cooked. I'm going to be honest with you. Whoever wrote this list and made it up and said David Harvey said this either didn't make it up and is incorrectly citing it, or they made up a really good description of like the different ways that capitalism creates crises. And I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to read it to you. And I hope that whoever wrote it knows that they should just put it in a blog instead of pretending like they're citing it on Wikipedia. So Yes, David Harvey does argue that capital accumulation reveals a number of internal contradictions. This is something he talks about a lot. This person, whoever wrote this, described that, for one, the first step is that labor power is broken down and wages fall. This is referred to as wage repression or wage deflation and is accomplished by outsourcing and offshoring production. And starting from wage repression is a pretty smart way to start the cycle, but of course the cycle can pick up at any different step, right? Danae, you're killing me. Capitalism is always in crisis, cultivator. So what they do, and you can look at the 70s as a great example of this, what they do is that they crush labor and make it so that the wages are very low. What's the current minimum wage federally in the United States? It's $7.25. Who the fuck can make a living off of $7.25 an hour? $7.50 an hour? I don't know that person. I'd love to meet them. Ollie. But yes, they find all these different ways to break union power, to union bust, and to push any type of reforms on wage strength. Because this is constraining on capitalism. You gotta have the workers they have to make peanuts so that you can make peanut farms, right? The workers cannot make too much money. So the reaction of the 70s to the crisis of underproductivity was to crush labor. Part of how you crush labor is by taking those profits from that wage repression and then essentially to build a larger market. And then when that larger market is built, where all these different products are flooding the market, the people who are making less wages now can't afford them because you crush their wages. So what do? You give them credit. Part of how you crush labor, by the way, you offshore it. You bring it overseas, right? Because there's always a different place where the worst of the crisis can get shuffled to. But somebody's always got to be holding the bag. It's the same thing that Ursula K. Le Guin was talking about in Omelas, the ones who walk away from Omelas. There's always somebody who has to be the victim so that everything else can work. So you shift all of this stuff offshore to these points of crisis where people will work for pennies on the dollar. We know what Nike does, right? We know what these companies do, what Apple does, right? And that also has the effect of crushing labor in the country that's from. In the United States. So labor gets offshored, then people don't make enough money, but you have all these extra products that are coming from Japan all of a sudden. So what do? You give people credit cards. You pump up credit markets. You build all these great credit plans. The same way that they do with sports betting, where they're like, you'll get your first 5 bets for free. It's just like an undeniable deal. Everybody wants to take that deal, right? Oh my God, I could just make $400 from my first 5 bets. And then they make you sign a bunch of stuff, and then they put you in this position where if you're not extremely cautious and smart and willing to walk away sometimes from things that you thought you were going to get, you're going to be in debt. You're going to be in so much debt, which is the point, right? It's usury. You create usury so that people can now spend money. When people are spending money, the profits increase even more. Only problem is everybody's in debt now. Crazy debt. I can actually look up really quickly U.S. household debt. Okay, fun facts for everybody. From Market Watch Guides. Household debt hits an all-time high of $18.2 trillion. May 18th, 2025. You got people in debt taking loans out for student loans. That's basically out of the picture. Nobody even deals with those. I can't remember the last time I looked at my student loans, okay? We just pretend they don't exist and we walk away. The real debt comes from mortgages and credit card debt and all these other different ways that you take on more and more debt from the credit system. While you're doing that, economy's going rocket high. Economy's just, right? Because all the economy sees is companies making more profits. Therefore, companies are growing. If all the companies are growing and becoming more profitable, money is not real, SA. It really isn't. So what happens then when everybody's in a debt crisis? I just mentioned mortgages, right? I just mentioned that people get in tons of debt from their mortgages. And then what happens when you can't pay off your debt? Stuff happens, right? Defaulting, for instance. So does this bring anything to mind, like perhaps, periods of history, maybe recent, maybe not, where people had mortgages and had all this debt, and it was revealed that suddenly a lot of them could not pay off that debt because the loans that they took out were extremely predatory. And as more and more people defaulted, the nature of the bonds that were based on those loans became basically toxic, and more people dumped them. And this created a massive crisis in the United States economy that affected the economies everywhere else. Oh yeah, Bass Fishbone, Charlie Kelly, 2008, right? So financial crisis happens. So you start from productivity crisis, repressed wages, stagflation and lack of purchasing crisis, credit cards. Then you have financial crisis. And then what happens when there's a financial crisis? Well, you'll be shocked to find out that the United States economy and financial system is the basis for the economy and financial systems everywhere else. Because the United States already has all this money and all this property and dominates other people's relations through having all of this massive empire. And so if the United States is starting to collapse, what happens everywhere else? Well, all these countries that already were smaller and that were already in massive debt to the United States and reliant on the United States economy, well, they start crashing. And then what happens is the United States figures out how to dump more and more of the economic disaster elsewhere, because that's kind of naturally how it works. Essentially, what you have is that the crisis just gets displaced, it gets shuffled around. And what we're looking at is that we've never left 2008. The recession never ended. 2016 never ended. All these different periods of recession and crisis have not truly been addressed in the sense that they've ended. They've just been shuffled around into new crises. So the first answer to why the far right surges is economic crisis, financial crisis that leaves more and more people without jobs, without the ability to feed themselves, without the ability to get a doctor. Those people are isolated, they're alienated, and they see no way that their interests can be represented. They have no way to unionize their labor in a lot of different situations, right? They're also people that relates their situation to one of loss. Because with conservative values, you teach people about what they are owed. You teach people about what used to exist that no longer does. And so you build a polity. You build a group of people that not only are in economic crisis, but also conceive themselves as having used to be doing well. We used to be a country. I used to have more than I do now. Things used to be good. What happened? Once you get that in people's minds, and this is another wake-up call to all those people that are like, oh, we used to be so great before 2020. What happens in people's minds when they associate the problems of today with being problems of something being taken away from them that used to exist for them, that they used to have in the past that got taken away from them? What happens is that they start getting really angry at everybody that they conceive of being the new successful people. Everybody that they conceive of as being new. Everything that they conceive of as being foreign and modern. And that is what conservative values is based on, right? You attack all modernity because you've been, as Jonathan puts it, you've been inundated with weaponized nostalgia. And this especially works if you belong to an ethnic group that was privileged through apartheid. So you're a white American, yeah, you can look back in history and see those periods of time before that productivity crisis, etc., and say, I used to be doing good back then. My people used to be doing good back then. Then what happened? What happened? I don't know, but all I know is we got to make America great again. That's why conservative values are really, really, really dangerous, and we're all gripped by them to different degrees. Conservatism has many different functions. I would argue, and this is a separate stream, but I would argue that a lot of leftists and a lot of liberals are also conservatives. I would argue this, but it's you gotta let me, that's a different conversation. Give me like 3 years, I'll get there. Regardless, conservative values are very, very useful ways to take people's immiseration and turn it into anger that they can weaponize. And that's how you get MAGA, right? But it's not just that, because we've had capitalist crises before. And much as you can say that Richard Nixon was a right-winger and a piece of shit and did horrible things, people wouldn't say that he's a fascist, especially in the sense of attacking his own citizens in the same way that Donald Trump does. So what's special about this moment? Well, first of all, we have to understand what brings about fascism in the first place. So crisis, that's the big word, right? What is also the central reality of fascism? How does fascism emerge? When we look back in history and we think about what happened in Italy in the 20s and 30s, we think about what happened in Germany in the 30s and 40s, we see reactions to crisis. In the case of Italy, devastation from World War I and lack of economic self-sufficiency, coupled with the rise of communism, communist and socialist left-wing organizing groups that take the wartime reforms that are done by these countries and the popularity of them, that, centralizing of the economy and all that stuff, and go, we should just do that. Why are we still being capitalist when we could centralize the economy and distribute it fairly among the populace? Why should we do that? Gains a ton of momentum. And so what do the fascists do? In Italy especially, they push austerity and anti-communism. So it's not just about austerity. It's not just about, right-wing economic thought and, Hayek or whatever. It's also rampant anti-communism. And it's not just about conservative values. It's about extremely heightened conservative values to take up arms against left-wing values. Does that make sense? So in the United States, we don't use the term communist like we used to because we've all assumed pretty fairly that we've eradicated all communism from the face of the earth. So what do we call them instead? We call them woke. The wokes are the new future polity that destroyed humanity by coming along and proposing equal rights for black people and women and trans folks, right? And there's all these different ways that these conservative values overlap with necessary values of the state, of the empire. But the key difference between why in certain cases you just have a right-wing government or a center-right government emerge and push austerity, the good old Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, George W. Bush way, and what we have now with Trump and what we're having now with all these different emergent far-right parties is that they have a specific enemy that they also see it necessary to eradicate. Now, when Italy, and this is something we can learn from the book The Capital Order by Clara Mattei, which I have talked about at length in this channel before. We have learned from that book, and others like it, that Mussolini, when he took power in Italy, the liberals loved it. They loved it. Particularly, like the British liberal government loved it, and the leading economists of the time, which had just put forth their ideals of austerity, loved it. Why? Because they were like, look, don't really care much for the guy. It's not really about that, but he's the right face to impose austerity in this moment. So essentially, liberal economics, which is to say capitalists will use whatever they got going for them to give you austerity when they need austerity. Because austerity is a way of disciplining people. We take everything away from you so you learn not to fucking fight the government anymore. So that you learn not to stand for yourself anymore. So that you learn not to fight for equal rights. We need to scare people so that they don't do that anymore. We need to scare people. With the case of austerity, if there's not really an emerging, big populace that we can use as a boogeyman, and if there's not an emerging sort of economic populism and all this other stuff, well, we can just elect a good old-fashioned white guy that's just going to raise taxes on the poor and lower taxes on the rich, etc. And we'll do that for a while, and maybe when we get a profitability thing going again, we'll give people a little bit more. That's how the capitalists think. But when the situation is a bit more complex, because there are a lot of people that are in the country that are supportive of equal rights and civil rights and that are making all these progressive pushes, those people have to be made an enemy and they have to be repressed. So Mattei writes, austerity's capacity to impose and reinforce class structure is the true measure of its efficacy. It was a servant to and indeed the primary safeguard of capital order. The austerity economists were not infatuated with Mussolini's charismatic figure per se, but rather saw him as the right man at the right time to implement the principles of pure economics. Do you see what I mean? Pure economics. Whoever's going to do it. If you got to show up and be boring, be boring. If you got to show up and start a civil war with people, do that. If you've got to promise to start eradicating parts of the population, do that. Do whatever you got to do. Just give me austerity. So that's why the far right gets power. Because if the far right is inconvenient to capital, then you will see how quickly they get rid of them. They really don't have a very long shelf life. They're a break box in case of emergency, break glass in case of emergency tool. But they exist specifically so that everybody gets really freaking scared. And so that when austerity is going hard and the libertarianism is going hard, all the people that used to fight it are now cowering in fear and running away because they're afraid of getting killed. So historically, that's what fascism's role is, and that's what separates it from just your average right-winger. And what's interesting about that is that there's this old adage, right? As I move into my last point about this. There's an old adage that fascism is colonialism turned inward. This is kind of the thinking from post-colonial scholars, post-colonial thinkers like someone like Aimé Césaire, who talks about how Europe was disgusted and ashamed by Hitler because Hitler was doing domestically to other Europeans what Europeans had normalized was okay to do to Africans. And the reality of this is that horror is even overstated. That horror is overstated by, you can see now with the government of Germany, they overstate their horror having done this to their own populations to suggest that they're no longer doing it, that they're no longer interested in it, to suggest that they've moved on from that. But Europe will always convince you that it's moved on. The West will always convince you that it's moved on. And meanwhile, what happened to a lot of the Nazis? A lot of them just drifted away, stayed in different parts of power in different parts of Germany, and particularly the part of Germany that was allied with capitalism and the Americans more. Nazi people showed up. Even in Austria, Nazis remained in different places. Same thing in Japan. A lot of the people who were doing the worst of the worst for Imperial Japan were politically relevant again a few years later. But fascism, in that way, is colonialism turned inward. What really makes it so that this fascist turn is so inevitable in the United States and so prevalent in other parts of the world is the climate crisis. Climate colonialism. What climate change has done is created a new realm through which there's a crisis for the capitalists and through which there is a crisis of necessary domination, so to speak. And this is something that is written about and is covered extensively in a lot of ways by Ajay Singh Chaudhry in the book The Exhausted of the Earth, which I've also talked about at length on this channel. Ajay Singh Chaudhry says that it is less that the world has decolonized than that colonial relations have become more omnipresent. It is less that the world has decolonized, that colonial relations have become more omnipresent. So all this decolonization that the UN was super hardcore on about after World War II, that decolonization was really just a reshuffling. Of course, it was still significant. Decolonial efforts were still significant, and you should never get into fatalism and doomerism and then end up downplaying the importance and the true, like, you can even say heroism of things like the Mau Mau Rebellion, right? Ultimately, those shifts in sovereignty for the colonized world came along with shifts in repression in the colonizers' world. And you see glimpses of that in the 50s and 60s with McCarthyism. You see glimpses of that with the war on drugs. But you've never seen it more pungent than now. And this is where, empire is truly revealed for what it is, and people have to reveal it for what it is, and why nationalism fails the way it does as anything liberatory. It's because countries are going to get their profits from somewhere. These capitalists are going to get their profits from somewhere. And sometimes when you have a good life going on in America that you've seen, shift in the right direction, that's because somewhere else, somebody else is taking the brunt of that exploitation for you. And this is, again, I don't think you should downplay at all the very, very valuable struggles of unions and socialist organizations, even in the developed world. That's despite the fact that a lot of them have, at different points fallen into reactionaryism and been, colonial institutions. But essentially, what you're seeing now is that the line between the core and the periphery is breaking down. The line between the colonies and the metropole is breaking down. Everybody is colonized. It doesn't matter where you live in this world, you could be a colonized person. That's what's changed. If you are a white, educated, working class, Jewish person in the United States, and you protest, against the war on Palestine, against the genocide of Palestinians, you're going to get treated in the United States the same way that they treat people in Palestine. Of course, this is with caveats. Of course, they do all these different ways. They have all these different ways of changing how they do it or holding back, etc., because there's still a lot of institutional power maintained in keeping the empire. But it's never been clearer than ever that the same group of people is in every single country doing the same shit to everybody. It's never been clearer than ever that the capitalist classes are working together to union bust in the United States and to plant disinformation campaigns in the Philippines and to buy up all the real estate in Europe. They're all the same entities of people, and every single person who is not a member of the elites looks at this and goes, I am on the outside looking in. I am a subject of I am a colonized person. I am a subject of an empire. And I am not a first-class subject of that empire. I'm not a friend of the empire. And therefore, I'm an enemy of the empire. That's what people are kind of realizing, right? And so Ajay Singh Chaudhry illustrates this brilliantly in his book. It's something that really brings to light what Trump is today. Is that in essence, there is this system we run on that creates crises all the time. And much as capitalists have learned all these different savvy ways of adapting to crises and exploiting crises, there's still crises to capitalists. He points out that at one point, the growth and the profitability has reached its end. That the capitalist system has essentially reached its end, and that's a central conversation within what he calls global business discourse. He says, growth itself, whether one wants it or not, appears to be largely at an end. While global south states will continue to grow, this is highly unlikely to make up for the collapse in the global north. And this turn of affairs is better acknowledged in global business discourse as the productivity crisis than it is in many common left theories, ecologically oriented or otherwise. What he's saying is there's just no more growth. There's nowhere for the capitalist classes to extract their growth from. And so they're making it up. They're doing what Marx called fictitious capital. They're proposing new AI features that will receive another quintillion in fucking investment capital from XYZ firm. And there's a massive, massive stock market bubble as a result. So you have all this profit, these lines going up, and they're based way less in material reality than ever. Because this is the response from that class to the productivity crisis, to the crisis of capitalism that they're facing. And not only is that crisis of capital one of bare reality, that there's just what else are you going to extract? What else are you going to exploit from the world, right? People talk about, the U.S. potentially going to war in Venezuela. Might happen, might not happen. But what's crazy about that is empires used to go to war with territories so that they could control them and then they could use their resources. We already use the resources of the global south. We already are at an economic warfare with Venezuela and have been for centuries because they don't quite give us enough capital as they used to. We don't need to show up with guns to your door to extract and exploit your resources and your working classes. Through financialization, we already do that. So finance has gone in this upward direction where there's no substance anymore. And you'd be wilding to think that these folks are not worried. It is very clear in their discourses that they're worried, and they're calling it a productivity crisis. You're seeing that rhetoric from the UK government. How can we make British workers more productive again? You can't. You can't, because you already figured out the answer to the productivity problem. You shipped all the jobs elsewhere, So now they're proposing AI because it's like, oh, this could be it, even though it's so obviously not. Obviously, AI cannot replace all of these different types of work. But the speculative nature of it, the fact that it could be that thing, is so important that you can't do anything except invest in it. It's the most important project in Western capitalist history. Why? Because the very possibility of it being the answer to the capitalist crisis and solving the capitalist crisis is the most important thing. It is literally like a life or death thing for capitalism. And the answer is obviously death. It's dying, okay? It doesn't work. There's no more profit. Where are you going to go? They're literally talking about colonizing Mars. It's over. It's so cooked. Capitalism is dying. But now they can't let it die for various different reasons. They've sunk too much into it. And so now they've got to figure out how to keep it going and the prospect of it being alive going for as long as possible so that everybody can extract as much as possible. And that's the period of time we're living in. Crisis. Capitalism has reached an untenable crisis, and all these decisions that are being made by politicians, by economists, are so contradictory in so many ways, are alienating people in so many ways, because it's literally the only thing that they can do to keep it going. Shauna Keller says, cancer also tries to expand infinitely in a finite space. Perfect example. So that's the situation we live in. And if that doesn't get addressed, if people do not prepare for that, if people do not wisen up and organize, then they're just going to find all these different ways to not only continue to extract and dupe people to keep capitalism alive as long as possible, but then also be prepared for an infinitely worse system when it collapses, right? Or at least as bad of a system as possible when it collapses. This is why somebody like Peter Thiel is talking about the Dark Enlightenment and bringing monarchism back. They're trying to figure out how to do this shit. They're already planning the death of capitalism because they know it's coming. And so they're turning the whole world into their colony. And what's interesting about that is they can't ever succeed as much as they want to succeed. It's up to us to prepare and then constantly be fighting for what we have and to distribute it in an equitable way, in a sustainable way that keeps us alive for as long as possible. And humans do that. That's what humans do. If humans can do all this collective action to work to try to preserve a system that is constantly dying, then humans can most certainly do what they've always done, which is figure out ways to survive, to adapt, and even to thrive in untenable situations. And so here's a couple of takeaways as I sign off. First and foremost, I want you guys to look into different organizations. Right now, I'm going to bring your attention to Cooperation Jackson. This is in Jackson, Mississippi. It's a federation or network of associated interconnected cooperatives that takes time, training, and capacity building, extensive research generation, and mobilization. It takes inspiration from the example in Kerala, India, worker-owned, democratically self-managed enterprises. Before you theoreticians show up and start going, cooperatives are just capitalism by another name, and it's just capitalism with extra steps, and da-da-da-da-da, I want you to actually take time to learn about what people are doing. because you can theorize every single effort that working classes and progressives do into the ground and come back to the argument that nothing is worth it and we're all dead. Or you can actually try to figure out what to do right now. So I'm really interested in this organization. I also want to talk a little bit about an interview that I did recently on September 19th, or I posted on September 19th with Daniel Jose Gastambide. And the reason I'm bringing your attention to this is because this also brings in a really important part of the queerness aspect. So another calling card of fascism is that it represses queerness. It represses queer communities. It's homophobic. It's transphobic. That's obviously what you see reflected in these transphobic policies. Other than, oh, these people are different from us, or these people are new and woke, gender equality and sexual liberation are also intrinsically dangerous to empire and to capital. And Professor Daniel Jose Gastambide, who has two really interesting books on Freud and on Fanon, and on psychoanalytics, radical politics, and bringing radical politics and understanding to the psychologist's chair with critical thinking, has a really interesting point here about sexual control.
So initially, it's play, it's feeling our bodies, kind of jumping everywhere, doing all sorts of things. And then over the course of development, it becomes focused on another person, becomes more centered on the genitals. Society, he argues, enters precisely at this point to do two things: to restrict the choice of the object to a cis heterosexual opposite gender person, regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of your gender identity. Society says you have to pick whom we say is the opposite gender partner, number one. And number two, it restricts pleasure to cis heterosexual genital reproductive sex, and in the missionary position to boot.
So this is a great interview with Professor Gastambide. Please check it out. You can access it through my Patreon. For even just $1 a month, you can get access to all these different great interviews that I've done. But the reason I bring that up, for obvious reasons, trans rights are fundamental to a progressive movement. Again, this idea like, oh, well, we should just alienate the trans people and then we'll win more votes, makes no sense. It doesn't win more votes. And if you're talking about actual liberation for working class and middle class people, ensuring that they get to do whatever they want to do with their bodies and whatever they're called to do with their bodies, and ensuring that people can express their sexuality and gender in different ways is crucial. It's crucial because that is one of the main things that empire and capital tries to do, especially in periods of crisis. It is a classic point of socialization in empire. We got to reproduce. We got to make babies. Otherwise, we're going to die. Well, we're not in a period of time anymore where everybody's going to die because we're not making enough babies. So why is that still going on? Well, for various reasons. Children are profitable and children are serviceable to empire. They become workers. That's something that Gastambide talks about. They become workers. They become non-workers. They become homeless folks that you can exploit in all types of different ways. You can't alienate people and expect it to do anything except alienate your cause. And that's something that you should be saying for sexual minorities, for folks who actually have a right to express themselves, and not for white people who already have all their needs catered to in society and are being hateful because they're being taught to for no reason, for no good reason. They need soldiers, exactly. Another thing that I'm going to do, the link should be in the description. I want to bring some attention to Saber and his family. So as you know, a genocide has been taking place in Gaza for a very long time. Some would argue since the Nakba, but especially a genocide has taken place in Gaza over the past 2 years. We've talked about it many times. On October 10th, the war was officially ended by Israel. We all know that that's not anywhere close to an end to the repression of Palestinian peoples. It's just another chapter in that. So if you can donate to Saber and his family, I have confirmation independently of this person's financial situation. Continuing to donate to folks in Gaza is crucial. It's crucial for them and their survival. Do not think that just because a ceasefire agreement has been come to, that means that everybody's hunky-dory now. And another way that you can donate, you can check out Gaza's Roots on Instagram. Really important grassroots initiative, donating, doing mutual aid in Gaza. Okay? And then, check out this VOD when it comes out on Elliot Saying Again. Thank you all for watching. I hope you have a great day.